Your house may have made more money than you did. And the strange part? It didn't have to work. It didn't have to get promoted. It didn't have to negotiate a better salary. It just sat there. While you went to work, paid the bills, bought groceries, and tried to save whatever was left at the end of the month, the house could quietly become more valuable. And for millions of people, that difference has become one of the biggest wealth divides of our time. Because the question isn't simply why a house is so expensive. The more interesting question is, why did owning a house become one of the easiest ways to build wealth, while earning a salary became a harder way to catch up? And once you see how this happened, the housing market starts to look very different. For most of human history, a house was mainly a place to live. You needed shelter. You built it, rented it, inherited it, or bought it. But modern housing became something else, an asset, something that could rise in value, something you could borrow against, something you could pass to your children, something that could quietly become a large part of your net worth. And this is where the story gets interesting, because if you bought a house decades ago, you didn't just buy somewhere to sleep. You may have bought a ticket into a wealth building system. And if you didn't buy one, you could end up spending decades paying someone else to own the asset. That's the part people often miss. The housing story isn't just about houses, it's about who owns the assets. Imagine two people starting their adult lives at roughly the same age. One buys a house, the other rents. The homeowner has a mortgage. At first, it doesn't look like much of an advantage. In fact, the homeowner may feel poorer. There is a down payment. There are monthly payments. There are repairs, property taxes, insurance. And then something strange begins to happen. Every month, part of that mortgage payment is slowly turning into ownership. Years pass. The homeowner keeps paying. Meanwhile, the property may rise in value. The renter pays rent too. But the renter doesn't automatically receive a piece of the building. That doesn't mean renting is always a bad financial decision. It isn't. It means the two people are participating in the housing system in fundamentally different ways. One is paying for housing while also accumulating an asset. The other is paying for housing without automatically accumulating that asset. And over 30 years, that difference can become enormous. Harvard's 2026 housing report illustrates the wealth gap clearly. Its cited 2022 survey of consumer finances data put median net wealth at about $396,200 for homeowners, compared with $10,400 for renters. That doesn't mean owning a home automatically causes the entire difference. Homeowners and renters differ in many ways, but it shows how strongly housing ownership is associated with household wealth. And this is where the story stops being about real estate. It becomes a story about money. For a long time, housing was expensive, but something changed. House prices began moving faster than incomes, and when that happens, the mathematics become brutal. Imagine your income rises by 3%. Sounds good, but if the price of the house you're trying to buy rises faster, you haven't actually moved closer to the goal. You may even be moving backward. That's why someone can work hard for 10 years, earn more money than they did before, and still feel like buying a home has become less realistic. The goal is moving, and sometimes it's moving faster than the person chasing it. According to Harvard's 2026 State of the Nation's Housing Report, existing home prices were 54% higher nationwide in 2025 than in 2020, and nearly 5 times median household incomes. Well above the ratio that was common in the 1990s. That's not just a housing problem, it's a wealth problem. Because when the price of entering the asset market rises faster than your income, the people who already own assets can pull further ahead. Here's the uncomfortable part. A rising house price feels like good news if you already own the house, but the same rising price can be terrible news if you're trying to buy it. Think about that. The exact same event can make one person richer while making another person's dream more expensive. If your home rises from $250,000 to $500,000, you might feel wealthier. And on paper, you are. But if you don't own a home and you're trying to enter the market at $500,000, that increase doesn't make you richer. It makes the door harder to open. This is one of the strange features of asset inflation. The people who already own the asset experience rising prices as wealth. The people who need to buy the asset experience those same prices as a barrier. And that creates a feedback loop. The longer you own, the more equity you can potentially build. The later you enter, the larger the mountain can become. Now, here's where the story gets even more complicated. Because you might think, fine, houses got expensive, but if wages rise too, eventually people catch up. Except housing costs aren't determined by house prices alone. There are mortgage rates, insurance, property taxes, maintenance, and the size of the down payment. Harvard's 2026 report estimates that at the end of 2025, the total monthly cost of owning a median-priced home was about $3,120 under its assumptions. The income required to afford that payment was about $120,800. 5 years earlier, the required income was around $68,700. Think about what that means. It's not simply the house costs more, it's the financial threshold for entering the system has moved. And that's a much bigger problem, because if you can't enter, you can't accumulate the asset. And if you can't accumulate the asset, you may miss out on decades of appreciation and home equity. Let's go back to our two people. Person A bought a house years ago. Person B waited. Maybe person B wasn't irresponsible. Maybe they were paying student loans. Maybe they were saving. Maybe they moved for work. Maybe they simply couldn't afford the down payment. Now, imagine they meet again 20 years later. Person A has a mortgage that is nearly paid off. The house has appreciated. They have accumulated equity. Person B has paid rent for 20 years. They've still spent a huge amount on housing, but they don't own the building. And now the house that person A bought for a price that once seemed expensive is worth several times that amount. Person B isn't necessarily poorer because they made bad decisions. They may simply have entered the system later, and that distinction matters. Because when housing becomes one of the main ways ordinary households build wealth, being unable to buy a home can become more than a housing problem. It can become a wealth problem. This is why the modern housing debate is so emotional. People aren't only arguing about square footage, they're arguing about access. Access to ownership, access to leverage, access to appreciation, access to a financial cushion that can be passed from one generation to another. And this is where the housing market connects to something much larger: wealth inequality. Harvard's 2026 research describes affordability as a widespread problem, with home prices and interest rates keeping costs near record levels. It also reports that only about 32% of US households met the income threshold for the estimated payment on a median-priced home at the end of 2025. So, when someone says, "Why don't young people just buy a house?" the real answer can be much more complicated than "they don't save enough." Sometimes the problem isn't only how much money someone has, it's how quickly the price of the asset they're trying to buy is moving. Because housing doesn't exist in isolation. If houses become more expensive, people spend more of their income on housing. If they spend more on housing, they have less left for other things. Less money to invest, less money to save, less money to start a business, less money to prepare for retirement, and less room for one bad month to become a financial disaster. Harvard's 2026 research found that millions of lower-income renter households have very little income left after paying for housing and utilities. Among renters earning under $30,000, the median amount remaining for all other necessities was just $210 per month in 2024. So the question isn't, are houses expensive? We already know the answer. The deeper question is, what happens to a society when the main asset that creates household wealth becomes harder and harder to enter? And we don't know the full answer yet, but we're living through the experiment. Maybe the biggest lesson here isn't about houses at all. It's about assets. Money sitting in your account can buy things, but assets can potentially grow in value. That's why people with capital often have a different relationship with inflation, debt, and rising prices than people who depend almost entirely on wages. And that's the thread running through almost every financial story. Who owns the asset? Who owes the debt? Who gets the appreciation? And who is left trying to catch up? That's the truth behind the housing market. If you want to understand why money, assets, debt, and wealth keep moving in different directions, subscribe to The Truth of Money. Because in the next chapter of this story, we're going after something even more personal: why your salary can rise, while your money still feels like it's getting smaller. And once you understand that, inflation starts to look very different.